How often do we see a sequel to a spin-off that's actually a lot of fun? What if you then also made it a tragic love story that involves zombies? That sounds like a Roger Corman or a Troma movie, but in actuality, it's Return of the Living Dead 3, and it's from channel favorite Brian Yuzna. Return of the Living Dead is a stone-cold classic, and it's one that I sometimes prefer watching over any of the original Romero trilogy due to just how different it is and how it sets its own rules. Part 2 I have great memories of seeing on TV at my Nana's house in Santa Ana, California on an old tube TV. That one skates the Evil Dead 2 line of leaning much further into the comedy realm than the first, which is pretty funny in its own way and right. While there is a part 4 and 5, God help us, they aren't really any good for anything apart from morbid curiosity or completionism. Looking at the third entry, it sits in that wonderful spot where, sure, it's not as great as the first two, but it's nowhere near as bad as what followed. That spot is ripe for what we like to call a black sheep around here. The first Return of the Living Dead is, well, it's not based on, it's more inspired by the John Russo sequel novel to Night of the Living Dead. The movie was a success for Orion, making $14 million on its $4 million budget, which of course means sequels. That first sequel would end up being Return of the Living Dead Part 2, which producer Tom Fox would decide to fund himself, assuming its success. He was wrong, the budget went up to $6 million, and the return on investment was only $9 million back. A third film was still discussed, and Yuzna was chosen because he'd always wanted to do a sequel to the original, and he'd been a proven success. He's a bit of a triple threat with success as a writer, director, and producer. His directing credits include Grossfest Society, Bride of Reanimator, and The Dentist, among others. We've talked about him in one capacity or another a number of times, and I can see that trend continuing for at least a couple other movies. He ended up being a little disappointed with the screen time of his last creation in Bride of Reanimator, because the producers said the only thing that was required of him was to include the trioxin gas that creates the zombies, and to have them crave flesh. He decided he wanted to make a creature the main character. Said character would be played by the absolute knockout that is Melinda Clarke. She'd gotten her start on the soap opera Days of Our Lives, but this movie helped push her up the ranks a little more with future appearances in things like Spawn, the show Soldier of Fortune Inc., and huge roles in shows like The OC and Nikita. She's still active today, but for a certain generation of straight-to-video horror hounds, she will always be Julie Walker. I say straight-to-video, but this thing did get a limited theatrical run that produced a little over $50,000 in sales. The other two main characters are Kurt, played by J. Trevor Edmond, and his military father John, played by Kent McCord. Edmund stopped acting in 1999, and his only other big horror role is in Pumpkinhead 2, another fun black sheep. McCord cut his teeth in the early 60s and worked steadily into the next decades with parts in Airplane 2 and a 10-episode run on Galactica 80. For Lance's sake, I also feel obliged to mention his part in Predator 2, and that he randomly showed up as a character in last year's big game release, Starfield. Kinda random, I know. The writer John Penny had a relatively short career that also included being one of the many writers on Best Horror Movie You Never Saw, The Kindred, and late 90s straight-to-video So Bad It's Good, Legend of the Mummy. The movie opens with exactly what this type of movie should open with, the government being scumbags and dumb and trying to figure out how to use the living dead as weapons. The movie does a good job acknowledging the previous ones, even if it changes some of the things here and there. The zombies, well, apart from the main character one, are not as, I guess, intelligent is the word I want to use as in previous movies, and they don't expressly go for the brains to ease their pain. There is still obvious pain in them, and the special effects makeup is solid for this era and type of movie. Yuzna does his job though, as the only rules were that he had to include zombies and the trioxin gas. The two lovebirds of the movie, Kurt and Julie, sneak into the military base that his father is in charge of, as you do. They have pretty much free reign over the facility, which is just terrible security. They see body parts being burned and then a corpse being brought back to life with some sort of gas.
Jesus Christ.
The military, Kurt and Julie, as well as us as the audience, get to see them attempt to control the undead with a paralyzing shot to the dome, but of course, this being a zombie horror movie and only 11 minutes in, that doesn't hold. The corpse takes out the medical personnel in the room, and while the zombies don't really feel like they do in the first movie, they're cool-looking ghouls and the gore gets the job done. At first, I struggled with this movie because it feels at times like a sequel in name only. The zombies are different, the tone is very different from the first two entries, and it just doesn't act like a Return movie, but at the end of the day, that's okay. Return of the Living Dead is technically a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, but doesn't do much to tie anything together other than a throwaway line from one of the characters.
Did you see that movie, Night of the Living Dead?
Yeah, that's the one where the corpses start eating the people, right?
Anyway, the military adjusted and wanted to make a zombie mech suits, which sounds to me like the same thing as those videos you see of people pissing off and knocking over AI robots on purpose. You're just asking for Skynet trouble. Our teens make it home for the required sex scene, and Kurt's military dad tells him they have to leave soon as he screwed up and is getting transferred. The expected disagreement happens, and the young son leaves with his girlfriend. The turning point for our characters, and the movie, happens when Julie dies in the most non-violent looking motorcycle accident I've ever seen. It brings up the question we hopefully all ask ourselves: what would you do for love? I'm not sure I'd bring back the love of my life with an experimental zombie toxin after watching what it does to them, but I'm also not saying I wouldn't. She wakes up and the movie more or less treats it like when the two guys from the first two movies get hit with the gas. It's a slow descent into death and decay. The movie does a good job with her and her journey, but just kind of plods along with various scenarios to stick her with. The bad news is these are very milquetoast things like a convenience store robbery gone wrong, and a fight with the gang,
Out of my way,
a sewer exploration, and a culmination back at the military base. The positive spin on things is the movie isn't bad at all, and I think that's maybe even one of the things that keeps it from being discussed more. No, seriously, hear me out. The movie has all the hallmarks of the era it was made in. It has unnecessary nudity, lots of death and gore, and makeup and special effects that stand out as one of the talking points for the movie. But, at the end of the day, it's not quite bad enough to be so bad it's good because director Brian Yuzna made it better than it has any right to be. Sadly, it's also not quite good enough to be an all-time classic. Maybe because it's missing the humor of the first two or the fact that it changes the rules, even within its own movie, let alone compared to the rest of the franchise, but it's missing I don't know, but it's something. Lance and I talk all the time about our love of full moon, or even full moon light stuff, like the movies of the late great Albert Pune, what I'd call, I guess, crescent moon? Anyway, all these movies fall under the category of so bad it's good, doesn't take itself seriously at all, or just knows exactly what it is to a formulaic T and makes it really entertaining. While this is admittedly a better movie in a lot of ways than them, it's just not as charming. Yuzna is no slouch as a director, writer, and producer, with his collaborations with Stuart Gordon or his other efforts like the Must Be Seen to Be Believed Society being highlights, and the heart is there with him wanting to do a Return of the Living Dead project from the get-go. The movie sits in the exact middle of the franchise, with the two before it ranging from undeniable classic to beloved silly sequel, and the two after it, let me check my notes, Necropolis and Rave to the Grave apparently, being justifiably not getting special editions like the first three, or hell, even talked about all that much. This isn't some lost classic or even hidden gem to be discovered. I wanted to talk about it as the last one to watch and the closing of a very loose trilogy of zombie goodness. The love story and tragic ending, special effects, and heart put into it all bleed through into a fun watch for horror fans. Sometimes, a black sheep doesn't need to be the best movie. It just needs to be walked through and reminded why it was made in the first place. Give the movie a shot if you're a physical media person, I know I am. You can get a full story and a hell of a complete edition to add to your collection. Return of the Living Dead 3 is a black sheep that begs to be given the respect it deserves. The same respect that the filmmakers put into its production. Check it out.